The Filoniverse will not only give us great Star Wars storytelling, but it will also save the sequels and take Star Wars into a whole new direction. In this video, we are going to be going over exactly how this will happen and what this will mean for the future of Star Wars and for the fandom. But as always, before we get started, be sure to subscribe for more Star Wars content. Now, let's get into today's video. Okay, so I have a few ideas on how this will happen. In my first, more aggressive theory, I can see the Filoniverse actually being a completely separate timeline. Like, totally and completely separate from the timeline where the sequel trilogy took place. I theorize that Dave Filoni will use the world between worlds caveat to take Star Wars into a completely new direction. Okay, now let's look at this real quick.
What? What can I do? Ahsoka!
This episode, where Ezra Bridger pulls Ahsoka away from Vader, saving her life, effectively creates a different alternate canon timeline. Okay, within the timeline that Ahsoka lives in, Ahsoka goes on and helps the rebels like we see. Episode 6, Return of the Jedi, remains intact with Luke being a beacon of light and Anakin Skywalker coming back and defeating the Emperor. And The Mandalorian also takes place in this timeline, and Luke takes Grogu and forms a new Jedi Order, and they also, Luke and Grogu, prevent Palpatine from coming back, thus preventing the events of the sequel trilogy from ever happening. In the timeline where Ezra doesn't pull Ahsoka out and Vader kills her, then the ending of Rebels doesn't happen the way that we see it. Episode 6 remains the same with Anakin defeating Palpatine, but because Ahsoka couldn't lead Grogu and Mando to Luke Skywalker and they couldn't prevent Palpatine coming back, then the Emperor returns, and this causes the events of the sequel trilogy to unfold like we saw them at episodes 7, 8, and 9. Now, the separate timeline, the one where Ahsoka lives, is going to be the timeline on which the Filoniverse will take place. The Mandalorian takes place on this timeline, as does the ending of Rebels, and the Ahsoka show coming to Disney Plus will also take place on this timeline. Now, there are a few things that make me think this. One is that in that episode, the one where we see Ezra pull Ahsoka out and save her life, that happened in Rebels, Season 4, Episode 13, titled The World Between Worlds, and it came out in February of 2018, months after the release of The Last Jedi in 2017. Now, we know that not everyone was a fan of The Last Jedi, and I can only assume that Dave Filoni knew what was going to happen in Episode 8, so he secretly planted a way for him to create a separate timeline in order for him to go back and fix everything. And I know that some of you might say, well, hey, the Rebels episode was probably written before The Last Jedi even came out, so how would Dave Filoni even know what was going on? And that's wrong. The Episode 8 script was written and done before Episode 7, The Force Awakens, was even released in theaters. So I guarantee you that Dave Filoni knew what was going to happen in The Last Jedi before he even wrote that Rebels Season 4 episode. So perhaps this is why he created that escape, or this loophole, if you will, in the Star Wars timeline, so that he could go back and tell an alternate canon story. This would also explain why in Episode 9, The Rise of Skywalker, we hear Ahsoka's voice speaking with Rey from the netherworld of the Force, because in the timeline that the sequel trilogy takes place in, she's dead, because Ezra never saved her. It would also explain why Luke said that Ben Solo was one of his first students, even though in The Mandalorian, he took Grogu years before he took Ben as a Padawan. Because in the timeline that the sequels take place in, Grogu wouldn't be with Luke, because Ahsoka never would have guided Din Djarin to the Jedi. It would also explain why Luke was so miserable and gave up, because Palpatine came back and the dark side was so strong during the time of the sequel trilogy. While in the Filoniverse, in the separate timeline, Luke and Grogu have an opportunity to stop Palpatine from ever returning, and that way, Luke can build his Jedi Order and keep Ben Solo on the light side of the Force, and Luke can still be that happy, optimistic, hopeful hero that we all know and love. So this is the way for the Filoniverse to become an alternate canon timeline for Star Wars, while also leaving the sequel trilogy as canon, except technically they would be on a separate alternate canon timeline. Now, I know that most of you may be thinking that this timeline theory sounds far-fetched, and believe me, I am not a fan of different timelines or dimensions or anything like that. I feel like it just muddies the canon. All I'm saying is that there is a way for the sequel trilogy to still be canon without it being the canon that everyone follows. Now, the sequels were not the best movies. Yes, I know, I have my problems with them, but they are canon. It would be a pretty bold move for Disney to completely erase them from existence altogether, which is why with this theory they can keep the sequels and also create an alternate timeline where they never happened. So they get the best of both worlds. They can say to the sequel haters, well, hey, follow this timeline instead, follow the Filoniverse timeline. And they can say to the people who really enjoy the sequels, okay, well, they're still canon, follow this timeline instead. Now, full disclosure, I do not think that this will happen. I do think that it's very plausible. I do see the way for it to happen and everything like that, but I do not think that Disney or Lucasfilm will take that route. As I said before, I think alternate timelines, they just muddy the canon and just make things messy. So while there is a way for them to do it, I do not think that Lucasfilm and Disney are going to do that. But there is a way. That's all I'm saying. I'm just saying that that option is out there. Now, in my second, more passive and way more likely to happen theory, I think that the Filoniverse and the Ahsoka show will be set in a time and place in that galaxy far, far away that we have never seen in official canon. That way, the future stories and shows and the direction that Star Wars will go will all be set in a place so far away from the events of the sequel trilogy, which will still be canon, but they won't matter or affect anything. Alright, that's what I find it to be more likely, that Disney is just going to completely move away from that side of the galaxy. I think that Ahsoka will search for and find Thrawn, and that they will deal with an unknown threat in the unknown regions. Maybe the Yuuzhan Vong, or maybe some other threat that is totally original. They could introduce us to characters like Mara Jade and Kyle Katarn, who could help repel this threat. They could show more of Luke Skywalker being the hero that we all know and love. They could do and tell whatever they want because it would be so far away from Rey, Kylo Ren, and the rest of the sequel trilogy that it really wouldn't matter. I feel that this is more likely to happen because it will be a way for Disney and Lucasfilm to say, hey, forget about the sequels. Yeah, they happened, they're still canon, but look at all these new stories that we are telling. Disney and Lucasfilm will bury the sequels and will not touch that era of Star Wars for a very long time. Now, they've already started to do this. I mean, look at the new shows that were announced. None were set in the sequel era of Star Wars. None of them are dealing with Rey or Finn or Poe or anyone. Disney and Lucasfilm have already begun to separate themselves from that sequel era in hopes that they can drive the fandom's attention to this new story and this new area of Star Wars. Now, I honestly think that this is more probable. I think that this is the route that Disney's going to take. Again, the sequels sucked. Yes, I know they did. I hated what they did with Luke Skywalker. I mean, really, that's my biggest complaint. And the hyperspace bomb. And Palpatine coming back. But yeah, I know that they're not the best, but it is time to move on and realize that they are still Star Wars movies. And just like we, as the fans, need to move on from the sequel trilogy, I feel like Disney is also going to move on from the sequel trilogy. I mean, we've already begun to see this happen, like I said. So yeah, again, I may not like the sequels, but I am not going to let that stop me from enjoying Star Wars. Many have said that there is a division in Lucasfilm. Now, whether you believe this or not, no one can deny that, at least among the fans, there are still some sore feelings left over from the sequel trilogy. Some people are calling for the sequels to be completely wiped out and erased from canon and have them fall into the Legends section of Star Wars lore, while the other side is saying that the sequels were awesome and that they need to get over it. And then you have me in the middle. And I'm saying, yeah, I hated the sequels, but I'm not going to let that stop me from looking forward to future Star Wars projects, and I'm also not going to try to actively ruin Star Wars for people who do like the sequel trilogy. Honestly, I feel like the only way to get over this is by utilizing one of these two theories. Either have the sequels fall on a different canon timeline, or have Star Wars just go in a completely different direction and have the Ahsoka show, among other shows, just completely ignore the fact that the sequels exist. Either way, the Filoniverse will save the sequels by keeping them as canon because either way, with both of these theories, they're canon no matter what. And finally allowing the fandom to move on and focus on something new and something better in the Star Wars universe. I know that both sides feel really strongly about this, which is great. I mean, it means that there are passionate Star Wars fans on both sides of this division, which is, you know, what we want. We want passionate fans to, you know, be part of the Star Wars community. What we need to remember, though, is that even though we may not like the sequels, they are still canon, and until something happens, it looks like they will remain canon. Now, I hate the sequels because they are Star Wars, and I would love to change some things, but that doesn't mean that I'm going to actively try and ruin it for other people who like the sequel trilogy. In the words of Lando Calrissian, I don't like it, I don't agree with it, but I accept it. Hopefully we can all just get excited about this new direction that Star Wars is going, and be excited for all the new shows, books, and video games that are coming out in the next few years. After all, that's what being a fan is all about. Anyway, that's it for today's video. Go ahead and let me know what you guys think in the comments below. I know you guys will. Also, if you haven't already, be sure to subscribe for more Star Wars content. And remember to forever be a Star Wars fan.